Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our Travel Risk Outlook 2020 live webcast, coming to you live from our London Assistance Centre. We are right where the action happens, so you may hear some background noise should there be any code blue calls or other assistance requests. My name is James Wood. I am the Head of Security Solutions at International SOS, and I'll be your host for this session, moderating the conversation with our two esteemed experts, both of whom are sat with me here. This is the first in our Europe-focused events that will take place throughout the next few months. And in this, we hope to give you some insight into our predictions for 2020. Before we start, I'd like to just run through some housekeeping for this session. You will be muted throughout. Should you have any questions, however, please do write them in the Q&A box at the top right of your screen at any time during the presentation. We'll be going through the questions, and our experts will be very happy to answer these at the end of the main content. Finally, at the end of the webcast, you'll be sent a recording and a copy of our 2020 travel risk map and the research findings. So, with the admin hopefully successfully completed, let me introduce you to my esteemed colleagues who have joined us today.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Katie Geary. I'm a medical director here, and I am also Head of Travel Health for Public Health England. And for International SOS, I've been leading on travel health issues for EMEA region.
Robert Condina, Security Director of the EMEA region, overseeing the 24/7 team here in London and across the region, providing our clients with information, intelligence, and in-country support.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Rob. So it's important to stress that actually this session is a culmination of a huge amount of research that our teams around the world have done in conjunction with other experts and also indeed with you, our dear clients. As you can see, we've focused on 5 distinct research pillars, which have helped us to discern our top 10 predictions for 2020. The first one being our Travel Risk Management Council views. This is a group of 35 representative experts within health, safety, and security fields across a breadth of organizations, from think tanks and associations through to NGOs and IGOs. It's also a result of the 4th year of our Business Resilience Trends Survey, our joint work with Ipsos Mori. During the course of this year's survey, we received approximately 1,400 answers from 214 countries around the world and received over 400 answers from within Europe as well. It also takes into account our country, region, medical and security risk ratings as well, which is our comprehensive overview of medical and travel security risks by destination, which we will go through in a bit more detail shortly. We're also taking into account our travel risk incident case data as well. So this is an analysis of the last 3 years worth of data that we've collected on our case activity from our assistance centres like the one we're sat in right now. And then finally, it's also through the work of our on-the-ground medical and security intelligence and teams. This is our established network of personnel located in over 1,000 locations across 90 countries. These expert resources have proved an invaluable support in providing objective, verifiable information and intelligence on emerging threats in these environments and, more importantly, best practice recommendations on what you can do about it. These research pillars have helped us also to update and review our travel risk map, a copy of which will be wending its way to you all after this session. It is important to also highlight that our health risk map has been delivered every year since 2010, with our comprehensive travel risk map, which incorporates both medical and security risk ratings, being published from 2015 onwards. So what's new in 2020? Well, we're going to touch on this as we go through the webcast, but we have seen some changes in our country's risk ratings. So perhaps Rob and Katie, could you give us some examples of, from a security and a medical perspective, of where we've had that change?
Certainly. Just this week, James, we've actually changed the country risk rating for Burkina Faso and increased it, along with some of the surrounding border regions. And it really follows a trend that we're seeing on a deteriorating security environment there.
Thanks, Rob. And medically, we have some good news and some not quite so good news. Places like Algiers that historically have been high risk, actually because of increased stability and because of input into medical services, we now describe it as variable risk, because we know you can get good healthcare in the capital city and in other major cities. But we also see that security problems have enduring impact on medical risk, so lack of comestibles, And this is true of places like Venezuela when we think about the current yellow fever outbreak.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Rob. So with that in mind, our focus in this session, and indeed the subsequent material that we will send you, as well as the other face-to-face events that we'll run in the new year, is our predictions for 2020. Now, some of you may recognize the model, the image that you see on the screen here, which is sometimes referred to as the Mollis Motus model. This is our travel risk resilience model, and it illustrates three principles of travel risk resilience. Prevention from known risks, so the when and the where can be predicted. Protection from the unknown risks, where the when and the where are harder to predict. And the productivity impact, which is namely brought about by organizational policy and process. We're going to use this model to articulate our top 10 predictions for 2020, which you can see illustrated on the right-hand side of your screen currently. So with that, we're going to use these top 10 as our agenda items for the course of this discussion, focusing on both prevention, protection, and the productivity principles. With Katie and Rob, we're going to work our way through these and take what our research has identified and ask why this particular prediction, but also, most importantly, what can I as a manager do about it as well? So we're going to move on to our first agenda item within the prevention space, typically focusing on what we see as some of the known risks. So our first top 10 prediction is that of risks born from the geopolitical shifts, and it's certainly one that we see as being one of the most important mobility challenges in 2020. So Rob, I'm going to throw to you on this one. Given some of the shifts that we've already seen during 2019, what has our research identified for 2020?
The research shows most organizations are expecting a significant increase in the disruption that is caused by civil unrest and geopolitical tensions. The reality is the probability of disruption is certainly high, but as well as staff anxiety, as opposed to physical harm, which is actually less of a probability during those events. What's key in civil unrest is that it can rapidly halt business operations, and so it's really important to be across what's happening globally. And on that point, I think we've seen over the last few months on such civil unrest in locations like Hong Kong, Algeria, France, Spain, Venezuela, Chile, Bolivia, and various parts of the MENA region. I think what that really indicates, James, is it can happen anywhere, and particularly locations that are considered low-risk destinations. So it just underscores the importance of having a global view and a global appreciation when looking at travel risk and managing your travel risk. For us, we're continually looking at forecasting what the impacts are likely to be for our clients. In some scenarios, it's becoming more difficult. The modus operandi of protester groups is, utilizing encrypted means and so on, is becoming much more difficult for us to forecast and understand where the impact will be. But I think what's clear that we can say in 2020 is a continuing focus on targeting soft targets and those that are likely to cause mass disruption, mass media coverage, and perhaps symbolic locations such as embassies and offices like that. So what do we do about it? I think for managers, it's really key to address this in terms of the people, process, and technology components. So from a people perspective, what's really important is about, where are your people located, and what is the traveler route in country? What's their commute? Where will they be moving between hotel and the office? And even that in itself, which hotels are being selected, and can they be alternates selected outside the impact areas? I think it's also important to understand what's the profile of the traveler, and does that profile in itself add to the risk that they may face in location? As managers and travelers, it's absolutely critical to be well informed and have an understanding not only of predictive analysis, but also of operational and tactical advice. So really timely in being able to change your itinerary and movements on the basis of verified information and intelligence. Process. How quickly can managers and organizations enable and communicate with their staff? How quickly can they rapidly enable their activation plans? How quickly can they relocate perhaps, or even consider evacuation in some scenarios, and quickly congregate or move to secondary sites? And I think that's really critical for organizations to continually consider, again, in any country across the globe, wherever they have exposure. And finally, from a technology perspective, it's all about communication. So what are the communication means that you have in an organization with your staff in country? What are the resilience on those communication means? Because often we see mobile communications go down or internet connection being disconnected temporarily during these periods. And then how well informed are your travelers in country?
Excellent, thank you. And also, just to stick with you, Rob, on this one, I think the tragic events that we saw in London last Friday have served very much as a reminder, but how do you see the evolution of terrorism in 2020 and its impact on organizations?
Thanks, James. What's really key is to understand, actually, over the last 4 years, the number of fatalities from terrorist acts has actually halved. But what we are seeing is an increase in the number of countries being impacted by terrorism. And I think if we look at 2019 alone, we see the two examples of Sri Lanka and Christchurch and those horrific attacks occurring in very low risk destinations, and both for very different reasons. That is national extremism, right-wing extremism, or religious-based extremism. On the former, national extremism, right-wing extremism, we saw an arrest overnight in the UK, and we're seeing an increasing number of arrests across Europe, and it will continue to be a threat into 2020. And when it comes to religious-based extremism, I guess ISIS and the Islamic State is the organization that has the most media exposure, and the reality is it probably will cause the most probable risk coming out of that. We saw a geographic decline in terms of their exposure or their presence in the Levant region, but their increasing presence in parts of Africa. And the reality is we continue to see a number of arrests across Europe and perpetrators across Europe, which indicates the continued level of risk that we have. I think we're probably going into 2020, and maybe, unfortunately, as an example, demonstrated last week, there's two ongoing threat vectors that are going to increase, and that is the returnees coming back from places like Syria and Iraq into Europe and re-immigrating, and as well as the release of prisoners that were arrested early in the phase of the initial terrorism arrest. And unfortunately, in some cases, rehabilitation hasn't been sufficient and significant in that matter. So what do you do as managers in cases like a terrorist attack? The reality is it's almost impossible to predict where and when it may occur. It is a matter of wrong place, wrong time. Certainly arming your staff with situational awareness in advance of their travel is absolutely critical. But what's really important is that the travelers, if they are in the impact zone, that they know exactly what to do, what actions to take in the first few moments, because it significantly increase their chances of survival. And then as an organization, understanding your exposure. So do you have staff located in that location? Can you quickly communicate with them and check on their well-being? And then ensuring that ongoing support, both from a physical and mental capacity, post-event.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob. Very comprehensive. Katie, we're going to move on to the next prediction now, and that is of mental health issues. Given the significance of mental health in the workplace and indeed more broadly, what should organizations be doing to tackle this?
Yeah, I think it's probably not surprising that we see mental health as a top issue, challenge, consideration. It's a very hot topic in society today, with conversations in the media, social media, led by high-profile celebrities, footballers, etc. We also have this millennial generation and Generation Z who are much more able to talk about mental health as an issue and to be much more open about it. I think the key things are that good mental health means good productivity, so it's key to support your employees. When we look specifically at travel, we know that about 45% of business travellers will say that they get significant mental health stress when they're travelling, and about a third of them will feel week-to-week emotional burnout. So it's a real pressing issue, and for a company, it's got a big impact on productivity. I think when we look at specifically why for travellers, we have to remember that our employed population come from the general population. So a percentage of them will already have a mental health issue. We know that the actual process of travel exacerbates and produces stress even for people who would consider themselves emotionally resilient. And that's changing time zones, unfamiliar situations, not understanding the language, a busy business schedule, and not taking exercise, etc. But if you have a low-grade mental health problem already, then that's going to exacerbate it. And then the third issue is what you're exposed to when you get there. And Rob touched on this about the, I suppose, low chance, but security issues. But we've also got to factor in natural disasters into that. And if they become unwell, and then this aspect of cultural shock, where you're faced with the unknown that you weren't considering because you're worried about business, you're not worried about the culture. So what can we do to assuage this impact on our businesses? I think first we have to stop thinking about mental health as a separate entity it has to become another non-communicable diseases. So we should be moving all to a well-being strategy. By opening up conversations, we reduce stigma, we normalise it, and we can then start to, once we know what the problem is, we can then start to discuss and look at solutions. We need to create this resilient culture of health. And what I mean by that is this open communication, really considering employees in their workspace, wherever that is internationally. Again, Rob mentioned about communication being critical during a security incident, and I would extend that to you need to be able to provide emotional support to your travellers, both during travel, before and after, and that means that you have to be in communication with them. And finally, I would say that mental health needs to have a specific mention in your travel health policy. It's got to be part of a consideration. For your long-term assignees, you need to be thinking, are they mentally fit to go out as well as physically fit? And is there anything you can do to your employee workspace that actually will improve their well-being and reduce the stressor?
Of course. Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. And we'll stay with you for the next one. But I think alongside mental health, our researchers also identified some important trends in physical health.
Yeah.
So could you maybe perhaps step through these and how they should be approached from a preventative standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to keep in mind when we're talking about physical health that physical and mental health are intimately linked.
Yeah.
So currently, mental health still has some stigma, so people might express it in physical health terms, but people with physical health problems often have coexistent mental health issues. We are travelling more and more, and we can see that through our case activity. You know, we've got an increase of 6% year on year. That's not surprising. The serious nature of those cases is reducing, which is a good point, but that's probably due to better prevention rather than them not necessarily a challenge to occur. If we look at the demographics of the people who are travelling, a lot of them are the more senior executives, shall we say. And if we look again at society, we can say that a lot of the problems that exist within society, such as obesity, lack of exercise, actually means that chronic disease is much more prevalent amongst our workforce. Again, very much like mental health for physical health, we take with us what we've already got. So if you've got somebody who has cardiovascular issues back in, you know, dear old Blighty here, when they're traveling, they don't leave those cardiovascular issues, they take them with them. So part of your preparation for your travellers should be to maximise their health before they go. So have they got enough drugs? Have they got the right drugs? Are they having regular checkups? One of the other problems then with physical health is, of course, what you face when you go there. And I think we're going to come on to this in climate change, but there is an increase in gastrointestinal diseases. There is always the risk of respiratory diseases, and we can see that that's one of our top cases. And so vaccinations and behaviour preparation for travellers is important. So thinking about malaria, taking your anti-malaria precautions, using bite avoidance. Travel itself will impose challenges, and so we can find that travel, if you've got an existing disease, can exacerbate. So we do find that travellers within the first 24 hours of landing will have their myocardial infarction or have their angina attack. So again, that goes back to making sure that people are well prepared. And again, for your long-term assignees, make sure that they have an occupational health assessment so that you know that they are fit to deploy, that they're fit to deploy to that country, considering the health threats in that country, and for the duration of their deployment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. So now let's turn our focus to those predictions within the protection space. So how organisations should approach what are more sort of the unknown risk, I suppose. So Rob, one of the fastest emerging risks, I think, in the last few years has been that of cyber. And our researchers had highlighted some key points on this topic for organisations. So could you talk us through your take on cybercrime in 2020 and what actions organisations can take to protecting their workforce and assets against this risk?
James, what's really interesting and what the research really showed is despite the prevalence of information security and the reliance on technology, significantly less than 50% of organizations address cybersecurity when it comes to travel policies, which is clearly not sufficient. We do need to continue the conversation. So what's the context of the cyber threat in 2020? We're looking at trade wars and geopolitical posturing, which will certainly increase the threat of cyber attacks from targeted actors. But also, if you look at your travelers, they're being exposed to usually unprotected cyberspace and additional, I guess, opportunistic vulnerabilities in that sense. So, so much of the focus in terms of information security capability development, the investment from organizations, the education, and the policies very much focus on the static locations, so office locations, as well as consumer interfaces. But rarely do they address the increased vulnerabilities of the mobile workforce. And essentially, what does that look like? Well, naturally, you and I will travel to airports and hotels and so on, and you're logging into the various open Wi-Fi systems, which naturally increases the vulnerabilities there. I guess another example we often see on Instagram and LinkedIn, the images of sort of saying, look at my office today, maybe perhaps with the Eiffel Tower in the back. But in that image in itself, with images of the office and the laptop and so on, it's really showing to the world some vulnerabilities and exposing the organization and the individual to some vulnerabilities in the cyberspace. And really, how do you address that? I think the examples I gave, what we're looking at there is the vulnerabilities come from the human layer. And that is much like the vulnerabilities of a static location. So what's really key is education, and education that is pitched correctly and readily accessible, and that specifically addresses the threats of the mobile workforce. And in addition to that, it really needs to highlight the threats of use of social media when traveling, be it for business travel, leisure travel. And I think the policies and procedures that I allude to really need to address the vulnerabilities that come pre, post, and during the work trip when it comes to cybersecurity and practices that they should undertake.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Rob, we'll actually stay with you for the time being as well, because I think as we are all acutely aware, our climate is changing at a pace that makes it more challenging for organizations to protect against extreme weather events and natural disasters. So, could you talk through what they should be doing in terms of to help best protect themselves and their workforce in this risk?
Unlike cyber, natural disasters are not a new phenomenon whatsoever, and they've been around for hundreds of years. And the reality is they can be quite significant in terms of impact, the breadth, the level and duration of disruption for organizations that we see. And certainly the focus is now really being put on it because of the links with climate change and the spotlight on climate change right now. And the reality is with the access to the right information and the right policies and procedures in place, some natural disasters like typhoons and hurricanes do offer enough lead time for organizations to make key decisions. And they often, many of these are seasonal as well. So you can start thinking about, is travel really required in this duration? And if it is, are the travelers, as well as your in-country staff, are they accurately and correctly briefed on what to do during natural disasters, and having the right capability and information at their fingerprints? And essentially, it's really important that organizations understand their own resilience level, right? Without the support of external networks and governments, what can they as an organization withhold? And then based on that, really monitor the key trigger and decision points that they need to undertake. And certainly as an organization and including senior leadership, which we've alluded to previously, ensuring there's a well understood and agreed approach to early evacuation or early relocation. And that's really critical. So many in the cases that we see, when it doesn't go so well, is really when some of the late decision making is made and very much last minute decision making made. Unfortunately, natural disasters don't always offer the luxury of predictability. And in the European context, we've seen Albania in the last few weeks, quite a significant and fatal earthquake occur there. And what that really shows, again, it can happen anywhere. But in both circumstances, what we recommend to organizations and what's really key is, in addition to access to information and intelligence about the scenario, is ensure that there's resilient office structures in place and that they are assessed by experts in that space. That those office locations and residential locations have emergency kits, that they have access to food, sufficient supplies of food, water, warmth and lighting, that there are fallback communication means, and that everybody in country, be it permanently or temporarily, are well versed on what the response and action plan is and what to do in cases of natural disasters, both again during the incident and post-incident. And really, it comes again back down to education and ensuring that people in country that do have an exposure to those particular risks understand what it is to do.
Thank you. So Katie, I'm going to hand over to you because I think the next one sits quite nicely. So alongside the broader environmental risks that we should be protecting against, we've also seen some significant significant infectious disease outbreaks in 2019. And our research has highlighted that this is going to increase in 2020, primarily due to broader factors impacting their spread. So could you talk us through this and explain why these factors play a part?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to pinch from you again, Rob, because the message I got about your climate change response was very much putting a framework of planning and readiness over something that might be unpredictable. Yeah. So, and I would say we have to do the same with infectious diseases. So we need to know what we're going to do in terms of a pandemic. You may not be able to control the start of the pandemic, but you can certainly control what happens to people within your organization during the pandemic itself. So all that is about planning. But to go back to your first question, I think this is a really, really interesting topic. In essence, you can only get an infection if you as a person are susceptible to it and you're exposed to it. So what we see through climate change is we see a change in rainfall rates, we see a change in temperature, and all of these actually are positive for our bugs, for the microorganisms, so the parasites, the fungi, the bacteria. And so what we're seeing is that we're getting expansion of these bugs, like Salmonella, for instance, into areas that they previously weren't. And also we're getting more diseases in other areas that we hadn't even considered. So in Europe itself, for instance, we had chikungunya that was an excursion in Italy in the late 2009-ish. That's now become established as a disease because you've got humans that are living there that are susceptible. You've got the vector, the mosquito, that likes the ambient temperature and the moistness. And so therefore it's become an endemic disease. It's a disease that is natural to southern Italy. Just this last summer, we've seen incursions of dengue and Zika into France and Spain. And the prediction is that these will also become endemic diseases to part of those countries because they have the vector, the mosquito, because they have a population that's susceptible, and because the environment is sustaining. The challenge for organisations is really about making sure that you're up to date with the information, because this rapidly changes, can change from week to week, can change from day to day. And some of the challenges about the infectious diseases is the part of your employment that are specifically at risk. So if we take Zika, for instance, that was a global expansion out of Brazil during the Olympics. We've seen it take hold across continents, and there is particular nidus currently in Thailand. But your risk is for those women of childbearing age. So it's a specific part of your worker population. But you need to understand that those are the people that need to have that discussion. So we've talked about regularly updated the policy. You put people near bugs, they're not protected, they're going to get the disease. So for some diseases, we can protect them. So we talk about vaccinations, and on average, they need about 4 to 6 weeks before you go to to your destination for you to be successfully immune, to have the full course of it. Some of those vaccinations are required for entrance to the country, and specifically I'm talking about yellow fever, and currently some countries for polio, because this is an emerging disease. We also need to make sure that we tell our travellers about behaviour and to minimise their exposure. So bite avoidance measures for dengue and Zika, because there isn't a vaccine for travellers for those two conditions, but they are mosquito borne. But also things like Salmonella that I've mentioned is all about food and water hygiene, drinking, washing your hands, etc. And then the final element, which is really, really important to your travellers' experience, is what are you doing about your returning travellers? Do you put on them an onus to have a medical check if they've had a fever? Do you suggest to them that if they are to be admitted into a hospital for a procedure within a year of their travel, that they should flag that up to the hospital because they might have a resistant bug. So these are critical. And in fact, the reason I talk about returning traveller is we have a current outbreak of, and I'm not smiling because it's exciting, of monkeypox in the UK. This is a relatively new emergent disease, but it was brought with a traveller who unwittingly travelled with that disease. So travellers are a really important sentinel for us. And if you have somebody who returns with infection, your response to that should be a lessons identified to see how can you modify your plan so that actually you are again putting order over something that at times can seem like chaos.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've cut off on some of the external factors facing organisations. Let's finally turn to those within our organisations that and how we should approach these from the productivity perspective. So, Rob, I'm going to throw this one over to you. I think what's emerged over the last couple of years is a phenomenon that is known horrifically badly as bleisure. But it's clear from our research that actually the debate over employers' obligations around bleisure will continue to rage. And can you give us a bit more insight into this and how organisations should tackle that?
Yeah, certainly. And as you see by the research, less than a quarter of organisations are actually addressing this in their travel policies. Certainly, the best performing is here in Europe, which is great. Up to 27%. And I've attended a lot of forums and conferences of late, and the grey zone of duty of care and specifically bleisure is perhaps one of the most discussed topics. And the only thing that's consistent is the inconsistency of approach that every organization is taking to this. And that's okay, right? The reality of it is the right answer is for the organization, depending on the industry, depending on the organization that it is, the internal cultures, the external factors like legislation and so on. And I think what's interesting or perhaps challenging for bleisure travel is the enhanced risk, right? Inevitably, perhaps sometimes there is risky behaviors occurring on the leisure component of a business trip, naturally, than would be during meetings and so on. It really begs the question on how confident are you in the location of staff and being aware of their locations during the leisure component of that particular trip, which perhaps feeds in nicely to then the ongoing debate between duty of care and privacy. And naturally, with GDPR legislation throughout Europe, that's a particular focus, indeed. So what's critical and how do organizations address it? I think the key bit is to address it, to ensure that there is a clearly articulated line and approach of an organization in their travel policy. And not only is it in their policy, but it's well communicated to staff that are seeking approval and undertaking bleisure travel. And this will ensure that both the traveller is clearly aware about how they'll be supported and whether they'll be supported during the leisure component of their travel, but also leaves less interpretation to liabilities and so on. Ongoing support is certainly seen as an additional employee benefit today, and I think that's only likely to increase into 2020. And so with that, inevitably, organizations are considering about what level of duty of care they continue to provide. And the reality is, with support of organizations like ours, access to information, access to alerts and specific briefings on the destinations of the leisure destinations of a business trip can come at perhaps no or very little additional cost. And that really is perhaps the base level approach that organizations should consider.
Fantastic. And it is, and if you can come up with a new term for it, that'd be fantastic as well. I'm actually going to stay with you as well, Rob, to address another topic that's emerged in our research, that of millennials and Gen Z, Generation Z. Obviously, all of us are Generation Z. We're seeing a generational change in employees, and with that, this requires businesses to evolve their risk strategies. So what are some of the things that they can do to stay in step with those changes?
Yeah, the change in the workforce is clear. I think it's clear in the assessment center, the system center behind us, rather. And it's certainly clear in the client engagement that we're having and the different profiles that we're engaging. And with millennials and Generation Z, what's really important to consider, I think, in all realms, but specifically in travel security, is they consume information differently. It needs to be certainly brief because our attention to detail, attention span isn't as significant. It needs to be readily accessible, and it needs to have a self-benefit component to it. So the element of what's in it for me. And so this is how we're changing the approach on how we're briefing clients. really ensuring that my staff develop and understand the profile of the traveler, not only the profile and risk profile of the destinations they're traveling to, and ensuring that then shapes the advice and how we're pitching that advice to those particular travelers. In this day and age, I think it's really important to understand the perhaps possible enhanced risks that may come from single female travelers or LGBTQ travelers, and really ensuring that we address it, but organizations consider it in their travel policies and in their programs. I think what's clear is that there is an expectation of organizations in current day to ensure that they do support the travelers, whatever their profile, and that they do continue to inform them. So again, what's really key is that the education is there and it's pitched correctly for that particular generation and of millennials. And we're likely to sort of see an ongoing dynamic risk management approach being needed to catch up and keep up with the generation change.
Fantastic. Katie, over to you for the next one. Alongside the changing nature of business travel and mobility, we're also seeing a shift in approach to duty of care litigation. Yeah. So could you explain to us why we expect to see an increase in high-profile duty of care legal cases in 2020?
Yeah, thank you, James. I think very much this is a product of itself. So it's sort of a virtual circle or a vicious circle, I guess, if you're an employer or a company. The main issue that is driving this requirement to, or these legal cases, is that the millennials and Gen Z are asking that question. They want a nice place to work as equal as pay and opportunity. Alongside that, companies are becoming much more astute about mitigating risks. And really in this risk, we're talking about the impact on their bottom line. With successful cases and with incidents, the profile is raised, and so therefore you get more people talking about it, and therefore people are asking the question, why is there not that duty of care extended to me? And one key example of that was the Susie Lamplugh case. In fact, legislation probably hasn't really changed. I think the specialists were saying that they've all stayed about the same. It is more stringent in some countries than it is in others, but actually it's the application of law, and it's really driving under negligence now rather than legislation. So if you're deemed to be negligent, you're much more likely to be taken to court about that negligence. So what can you do about it? I think first of all, it's about understanding your bottom line and how much your cost to your risk you want to ascribe. It's also about understanding that risks exist along the whole business travel continuum, so wherever they are in their workplace, so that the legislation that is applying to your UK business traveller abroad is both the domestic UK law as well as the local law. So you need to fully understand your legislative framework within which you're working. And then within that, you need to make sure that you are updating and validating those risks, because this is a complex and changing space as well. But if you don't do it, you will undoubtedly be faced with a negligence claim.
Thank you, Katie. So we're going to move on to our final prediction now. Katie, we're going to stick with you on this one, but we recognise that with the accompanying really strong growth of startups and SMEs, there remains this complex relationship between their approach to business and their duty of care obligations. How do you see typically smaller organizations tackle this challenge?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a real challenge. So you're a small startup entrepreneurial. The expectation is that these are going to have a greater market share in the next, 8 to 10 years. One of the exciting bits about the entrepreneurial stance is it's a new way of doing things. It's a new way of looking at things. But often these SMEs are focused on the product. And what they don't take alongside of that is that they have a duty of care commitment, whether they have one employee or lots. In addition to that, so they neglect it. When they do approach it, they tend to be quite naive about its impact and use a single source of information to devise their risk. So they use social media or media. And the problem there is that you get only one perception, and it is probably distilled and presented to you for a different reason. So you're not getting the truth. So what can they do about it? Because as we've said, it's quite expensive to have a full duty of care. The important thing is that you think about it. You actually do it from day one, that you are driving your business change, but you also engaged with key specific experts in their field, and preferably people who've had experience on the ground in the countries that you want to export to, because only by getting that granular, real-time local advice will you properly be able to inform your risk and therefore what your mitigating strategies are. And finally, I would say in all of this, don't forget that you have a duty of care to everybody that works with you, and planning will help you to prevent issues and will lead ultimately to greater productivity.
Thank you. So thank you very much indeed to both Katie and Rob for their insight into these predictions in 2020. I think an extremely compelling discussion on these trends that will hopefully help you to drive organizational prevention, protection, and productivity as we move through into the next decade. I think it's fair to say that in 2020, the only certainty is uncertainty, and that by using the power of your organizational duty of care, you can meet these challenges head on. I think it's also important to recognize that what worked yesterday may well not work tomorrow. So it is essential that your approach to prevention and protection should evolve to keep pace with the evolving threat environment, but also the evolving business environment that we're operating in. I think finally, it's about being suitably equipped to meet these challenges, no matter your size, as we just discussed, or your tenure. We, as internationally mobile organizations, cannot ignore our duty of care obligations. If we do, this can leave us being left behind in the global war for talent and could ultimately influence, if not define, our survival. So thank you, Katie. Thank you, Rob, indeed, for this. We're now going to open the floor up to any questions that have come through to the session. This is where I put my trust in technology. I'm going to take the iPad here and just have a look at a couple of questions that we may have had coming through here. If I just, they say never work with technology. Rob, probably one for yourself here, I think. Regarding the geopolitical risk, you said that we need many means of communication, but how can we communicate with our people when the network is down?
Yeah, and this was actually discussed at a forum I attended. I had the good fortune of attending earlier in this week. The reality is there's a couple of components to it. In preparation, it's something that's why we are engaging with our in-country network all the time, is to try and predict and preempt when communications will essentially be brought down or temporarily halted, perhaps is a better term, by governments. And what's actually really interesting is that sometimes the mobile telecommunication may be brought down, but not necessarily the internet. And those two things it's what's really important in that is that you have dual means of communication, even just on those systems. So ensuring that your travelers, and you have the means to communicate with your travelers via systems like WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and so on, as well as then mobile telecommunications. And then in locations where you expect, or perhaps there's a high prevalence of governments or because of natural disasters, communications coming down, perhaps looking in other means of investment. So devices like satellite phones should be also considered in those locations where it's not necessarily reliant on the local network.
Okay, fantastic. Katie, one for you here actually as well. I think it ties in with what you're talking about earlier about infectious diseases and those sort of aspects. But we heard a lot about Ebola this year again. Yeah. What is the current situation?
So Ebola in the DRC has been very much circumscribed into DRC. The control of the epidemic there has been hampered a lot by security and by societal challenges to what's seen as Western interference. But although it's not over and we're not out of the woods, actually, if you look at the outbreak curve, so that's the number of cases that are occurring each day plus the number of contacts, we've actually hit the peak and we are coming down the other side. So it looks like we're on the homeward stretch. let's say that takes another 6 months or so, because what we're finding is that areas that were once clear, we're just getting outbursts of, because of course this is a disease that lives predominantly in the animal environment, in the fruit bats, and therefore we can't eradicate the reservoir, we can only protect the humans.
Thank you. Rob, another question to you, partly because you're wearing a sweater, so you represent millennials and Gen Z very well. You spoke about them and about their different and the different risks, but what about their attitude to risk? How does that differ from what we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it came up in the research, and perhaps I definitely would not consider myself Generation Z, but I'd love to. I think what's important is the reality is of how they approach risk is perhaps they are more inclined to undertake riskier behaviors. I said during the piece earlier that I wasn't here to judge, but the reality is, I think if you look at some of the studies and you look at some of the behaviors, and I also alluded to social media, some of the social media practices where there is a component of boasting about what activity you're undertaking, there is definitely a high risk prevalence. And I myself, whether it being the running of the bulls or jumping out of a plane and doing skydiving, inevitably perhaps reflect activities that my parents certainly have never undertaken in that capacity. So it's something to address. And it only goes to underscore and highlight the importance then that between the organization and the employer, that it's crystal clear about what's the level of protection and what's the level of cover and duty of care. And obviously, if staff are then undertaking quite significant risky activities, hitchhiking or heading up Mount Kosciuszko, then there's some considerations there to be had about actually this is the extent of our duty of care. But again, what is the baseline that an organization can offer? It's certainly the ongoing access to information, the ongoing access to alerting, and ensuring that they're correctly briefed, even for the leisure component of their business travel.
So we'll probably leave the questions there for now. I think we've had a good few sort of cross section of questions. So thank you very much indeed for that. So my thanks indeed to Dr. Katie Geary and Rob Condina for their expert insights into these predictions in 2020. Alongside the discussion that we've just had, you can gain more insight into the research through our the Travel Risk Outlook 2020 paper that will be sent to you after this session closes. Thank you very much indeed for attending this webinar today. We hope that you found it interesting. As we've done over the last couple of years, if you'd like to gain more practical insights, please do join us for one of our live conferences that will be hosted throughout Europe over the next few months. Below, you can see some of the different cities that you can join us in, so please do register should you wish to do so. And indeed, if you have any further questions on our outlook in 2020 or any other travel risk management related aspect that we've covered today, please don't hesitate to contact us through the details on screen now. We hope that you've enjoyed our live webcast today. Thank you indeed for your time and your attention, and we look forward to speaking with you again at our upcoming live conferences. Thank you to Katie, to Rob again for your expert insight. It's been fascinating hearing about these predictions. So this now ends our live webcast. Indeed, your feedback is important to us, so please do take some time to complete the questionnaire that you can see on the screen, and we'll now proceed to close the session. Thank you.